active as possible. But much of the next 18 months from the spring of '89 on was spent with me at the White House and Jeff Bader over at the State Department on the China desk, sharing early morning phone calls to describe what horrible things had happened the night before and what damage would be done to yet another aspect of the relationship between the United States and China. Mike Oxenberg, who was sort of the original NSC guy working on the China relationship as Big Brzezinski's China hand in the NSC in the Carter administration, had worked hard together with Leonard Woodcock, who's ambassador in Beijing, to create as many interagency relationships as they possibly could so that the United States would have a deep understanding of what's going on in China, and the reverse would occur from China toward the United States, and that there would be institutional binding, because Mike knew at the time, and has said frequently afterwards, the relationship has a fragile character to it. It needs a lot of care and attention, the kind of gardening that George Shultz talked about. And we saw as the year wore out and as budgets came up for each successive department or agency of the U.S. government, the Congress would target those programs that had something to do with China and say, take that out of your budget. And we sort of watched this as one after another of these relationships wound down. By the end of 1989, after two famous trips first a secret trip by General Scowcroft and Larry Eagleburger to China in the summer of '89, and then another trip in December where they tried to find some basis for putting the relationship back on a more positive footing. There seemed to be, Deng Xiaoping seemed to be orchestrating within the Chinese government an effort to find a quid pro quo arrangement whereby we could rebuild some of what had been lost in the previous 7 months. And yet this immediately had a major body blow when the Ceausescu government fell in Romania, and the Chinese leadership had a view of Ceausescu being machine gunned by his own bodyguards, something you probably have not seen on TV, but which the Chinese had access to. And this led to a further a deep freeze in U.S.-China relations for another several months.
About another minute.
Okay. So that sets us up for the low point of damage control in the U.S.-China relationship. Fortunately, we're now about to enter into a discussion of the bumpy road going forward.
Okay. We're going to jump to Ken Lieberthal, who was the senior advisor in the Clinton administration.
Thank you very much. It's a genuine pleasure to be on this panel and addressing this terrific audience. As you know, U.S. relations with Asia have often been fraught with political interference of various sorts. It's worth, in that context, noting that the four of us have served, I guess, in a total of 5 administrations. The four of us are best friends. I think each of us has consulted with each of the others during the period when we've had responsibilities on the National Security Council. I think that says something pretty good about the underlying structure of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. I served in the second Clinton administration. In fact, I came into office right after President Clinton got back from his trip in 1998 to Beijing, a trip that, let me say, Jeff Bader staffed, and served until very shortly before the end of that administration. This was a period when I think the Chinese side, still in its foreign policy, tended to be quite tentative, have a strong sense of resentment at past treatment, tended to articulate principles, but to leave it to others to be proactive on real solutions to problems that we confronted. Once you put forward your suggested solution, Beijing's approach was generally to study it, criticize it, and then begin the real negotiation. U.S. policy during this period, I believe, was driven within broad parameters, both by a strategic framework that had a core initiative attached to it, and by domestic politics and international crises. Let me say a word about each of those dimensions. First, on the strategic framework and the initiative attached to it, the strategic framework was that President Clinton, by 1998 certainly, felt that China's integration into the global economic and political systems was crucial to peace and prosperity in the 21st century. And keep in mind that this was a time, 1998, when the U.S. really dominated the global system. This was not long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we were at our peak. And from that position, the president thought that if we can't get it right with China, and China get it right in the international system, we are in for a dismal future. And so he was prepared to do a lot to try to move this in the right direction. The specific initiative was one decided on and I think really committed to by the president in 2009, and that was to pave the way, 1999. That was to pave the way for China's admission to the WTO on the basis of a very rigorous accession agreement, because he felt anything less than a very rigorous agreement would not work well over the long term for China or for the international system. I can say that from the spring of 2009 on, he personally spent an enormous amount of time trying to clear the politics of and manage the substance of the U.S.-China bilateral accession agreement, which laid the basis for China's eventual admission to the WTO, actually when Jeff Bader was over at USTR in 2001. You'll find Jeff's name comes up no matter who's talking about what. He's been there in everything. Let me move to domestic politics, because what I've just mentioned is really the strategic high point. This is the forward-looking part. But I served during a period when President Clinton was under accusations on the Hill that led to an impeachment, and a trial in the Senate, and at the peak of power of senators like Jesse Helms, who did not see a positive role for the United States with China, and had enormous capacity to complicate anything we sought to do in that arena. The impeachment accusations, let me add, just to remind you of what that period was like, included accusations such as President Clinton in the 1996 campaign had accepted illegal campaign contributions from China and now was determined to pay the Chinese back by selling out America's national security interests to the Chinese. This was very ugly stuff, and it was very powerful. I think the impeachment situation both drove President Clinton increasingly to focus on foreign policy, where he could get more done, but at the same time, to be candid, limited what he could do with China, because many of the accusations had a China dimension to them. In addition to domestic politics, international crises intervened, and each of us, as Doug just mentioned, basically 1989 upset President George Bush's plans for a terrific relationship with China in dramatic fashion. For us, we had two big ones. One was the Asian financial crisis, which was roaring as of the time that I came into office in mid-98. I think the major effect on that in terms of our relations with China was that effectively we took the ball off of China, took our eyes off the China ball, I should say, during the fall of 1998. We came off of this terrific presidential trip, but instead of building on that in every way we could, we were so concerned with the Asian financial crisis that distracted everyone that we didn't effectively capitalize on the good work that had been done on that trip. And then, of course, in 1999, we had the catastrophic accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And that came a month after the Zhu Rongji visit here to sign the WTO accession agreement, and that visit was unsuccessful. So this really enormously complicated our relations with China, and it enormously complicated our efforts to reach a bilateral accession agreement to get China into the WTO. So let me make 3 points, kind of reflecting and summing up. One, I was privileged to be in the job on the NSC at a time when, to I think a somewhat unusual extent, foreign policy decision-making had gravitated into the White House, and the NSC played a particularly strong role. This was the president's second term. He was comfortable with the people, comfortable with the issues, and for the reasons I've suggested, really focused on foreign policy. So it was a terrific time to serve on the NSC, despite all the tensions and difficulties. I really feel like I was just extraordinarily fortunate. Secondly, domestic politics were extraordinarily brutal and partisan. At times, frankly, in dealing with the Chinese, we could legitimately use the tough cop, soft cop routine, pointing to the Congress as a tough cop, and, you know, it gave us some negotiating room. But at the same time, to be frank, it made it almost impossible to pursue sensible policies across the board with China. There were too many other forces that intervened that made that too difficult. And then third and finally, as I mentioned, this was still a period when the Chinese were often quite passive, reactive, and timid. For my thinking, too much so. It made some issues more difficult to come to grips with. I often wish that they would be more proactive and pragmatic. Now we'll hear in a few minutes Jeff Bader tell us whether I should have been more careful what I wished for. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Dennis Wilder, who was the Senior Advisor for Asian Affairs in the National Security Council in the George W. Bush administration.
Thanks very much.